Now I will fulfill my dark purpose, and the last of Microsoft will die. Obviously, there's been a lot of discourse online regarding the current state of Rareware, the Microsoft-owned studio that formerly belonged to Nintendo, which has long been considered one of the biggest L's in all of gaming. Microsoft acquired one of the all-time great studios, the studio that put together some of the best games ever made in the 90s. Games like Donkey Kong Country, GoldenEye, Banjo-Kazooie, Donkey Kong 64. The list goes on and on and on. Like, Rareware put out more games in the 90s than most studios put out in their entire careers. Okay? It was insane what Rareware was accomplishing back then. But during that period, and I think in the 20-year period following it, there was this very big narrative. There was this very big slant. This idea that Rareware was responsible for everything good there. Rareware was the team that was putting all this together, making all this happen all on their own. And Microsoft was the company that ruined all of that. Microsoft gutted Rare, and they prevented them from producing anything good. And my perception, as a hardcore Rareware fan, someone who loves games from their golden age period, from 1994 to 1995, 1999, someone who's a hardcore Rareware fan from their golden age, I can tell you for a fact that Rareware successes were not simply due to the worth ethic of the Stampers or the teams at Rare. It was directly influenced by Shigeru Miyamoto and the guys at Nintendo. That is the grim reality that everyone wants to brush under the rug. The big major thing that everyone wants to ignore. When Nintendo lost Rareware immediately fell off. There suddenly were no major hits. Talent began leaving. They started producing no new IPs, and eventually, within a decade, they were producing slop like Kinect Sports and Sea of Thieves. The naive thing to believe is that Microsoft pushed them into doing this, that they influenced Rare to be something they weren't. But looking at the people who remained there at the time, most notably Greg Mayles, the Banjo-Kazooie nuts and bolts guy. Looking at the statements the team has made over the years, looking at what's been happening there, and just the gutted, the cancelization of Perfect Dark Zero, Microsoft's quadruple A game, something that I called to be a failure almost immediately. It was very evident that Rareware's problems were entirely internal. Microsoft was not dictating what they could and couldn't do. Games like Conquer were censored on Xbox. It was less edgy than it was on 64. And, for a good long while after the acquisition, they were still trying to put out, new games, Grab by the Ghoulies, Perfect Dark Zero, Cameo, Viva Pinata. They tried really hard to make these games successful, innovative, tentpole titles for the Xbox. But what ended up happening is that they ended up in complete and utter failure. That's right. None of these games took off. None of them were relevant. In spite of Rare's golden image as the best studio in the industry, shifting gears and supporting the big bad Xbox, one of the two real video game consoles in the industry. It did not magically make the company better. They did not magically start putting out better games. If anything, they immediately started getting worse. And hardcore fans were quick to point this out, but no. Everyone else was sitting there for years telling themselves that Rare would make a comeback. They just had to find their footing. They just had to find some good ideas. They just had to reinvent themselves. They had to deal with Microsoft. The endless copes resulted in where we're at now, where the company has not produced anything of value in legit 25 years. Even before the Microsoft acquisition, they were putting out lots of duds, including the original Conker's Bad Fur Day, Star Fox Adventures, and Jet Force Gemini and Banjo-Tooie, right? Even back then, they were struggling with staying relevant because they were bleeding talent, and they felt that they were better than Nintendo. And I do think this is like the important thing to understand about like Rareware's like corporate culture is that they really thought that they were too good to continue working under Nintendo, which is why they went under behind their backs and sold themselves to Microsoft. Like there were like a lot of internal discussions about where they wanted to go. And one of the things Rareware wanted to do desperately was to be taken seriously by the gaming journos. Ooh, Conker's 12 days, 12 Tales. That was too kiddie for the hardcore, mature game journal audience, So they retooled it into being some like South Park as comedy, completely losing sight of like what the game was originally supposed to be about, like traditionally most people have like praised the decision as being like very daring and edgy and like more mature, but the reality is like they simply didn't respect Nintendo enough to continue with what they had been doing during their golden age period. That's like the reality of it, is that they saw themselves as like being this studio that was beyond like making simple kids games and wanted to do something more, wanted to do something spectacular. And that hubris led to them like selling out to Microsoft and led to them just never ever putting out another hit because they did not respect Nintendo, the industry leader's feedback in regards to their development and what they were doing creatively. Shigeru Miyamoto, when Grab by the Ghoulies was still being produced as a GameCube title, was telling them, stop with the sex jokes. Stop making it so adult. Because Rare simply had no idea who the target audience was. Because it wasn't kids, but it also wasn't like the Xbox's core audience of like Halo dude bros. Like Grab by the Ghoulies fundamentally had no audience. And that's why it's become like completely forgotten by history, other than like extreme hardcore like Rareware fans like myself. So like with that being said, like everything that's happened over the past 25 years in regards to this company is entirely their fault. They sold themselves to Microsoft. They antagonized Nintendo. They put out flop after flop after flop, blaming their fans for wanting more Banjo and Conquer while putting out like nothing appealing. Like again, back in the 90s, they were like innovating and putting out new characters and ideas all the time. Like in 99 alone, they probably produced like more games than their entire like Microsoft era. It's like everything in the Microsoft era was like a sequel or a rehash or just something that just completely didn't catch on. And it was entirely their fault. They refused to learn, they refused to grow, they refused to like know their place as a Nintendo subsidiary, and as a result, they just completely imploded. And you know what? They deserved it. Everything bad that happened to Rareware was entirely their fault. They didn't want to put in the work. They didn't want to put in the effort. They didn't want to like produce something that people actually wanted to play. No, it's entirely what they wanted. It was entirely about satisfying their own egos and their own ideas of what should be successful instead of like producing something that people would actually want. There was no excuse, none, not to produce a third Banjo game. And like don't believe like people at the company who tried to say that like Banjo 3E was just a joke. That's obviously just cope. But like it really needs to be said more that like these guys completely botched any chance they ever had of becoming successful on Xbox before like the deal was even sealed. The reality is they were already making very poor decisions, screwing with Nintendo behind the scenes and causing all these problems. Probably most notably with DK64 and Perfect Dark requiring the expansion pack. But like there were a lot of examples of like Rareware just causing all these problems for the company, and it does need to be like explored. It does need to be like it does need to be explained to fans that like everything bad that has happened to Rareware is entirely their fault.